Melissa stumbled into the heavy rain as Anthony pulled her by the wrist. The storm beat down hard, soaking her thin cardigan until it stuck to her skin. Water dripped from her hair into her eyes, but she didn't raise a hand to wipe it away. She held herself tightly instead, shivering under the cold and the weight of humiliation. From behind curtains and half-open blinds, neighbors watched. Their faces glowed faintly in the dim light of their living rooms, silent witnesses to her shame. No one opened a door. No one stepped forward. Melissa knew they wouldn't. They never did. Anthony's voice rose above the storm, sharp and cruel. Useless. Ungrateful. A burden. That's all you'll ever be. The words struck harder than the rain. Melissa lowered her gaze, pressing her lips together so no sound escaped. She would not give him the satisfaction of hearing her cry out, even though tears were already streaming down her cheeks, lost in the water pouring from the sky. Anthony's grip tightened before he shoved her away from him. She stumbled back, her shoes splashing in the puddles. Her chest ached, but she stayed quiet, her arms wrapped tight around herself as though the thin fabric of her cardigan could protect her from both the storm and the man shouting at her. Inside her, a different storm raged. She wanted to scream that she was the one paying for the house, for the food, for the bills that kept the lights on in the very rooms where neighbors now peeked at her. She wanted to shout that without her, there would be nothing. But her voice stayed locked inside, buried under fear, loyalty, and years of being told she was not enough. Anthony stood tall, chest heaving, rain sliding down his face. To the world, he looked like a man in control, disciplining his wife. To Melissa, he was a crumbling shadow of the man she once believed in. She knew the truth. She carried it every day, through 12-hour nursing shifts, through endless budgeting at the kitchen table, through sleepless nights where she wondered how much longer she could keep everything from falling apart. She was not useless. She was holding everything together. But no one knew. No one saw. Melissa's sobs quieted into silence. She stared at the wet ground, her feet heavy as if they were sinking into the earth itself. Around her, the neighborhood went still again, blinds snapping shut one by one. The storm held on. Anthony's anger simmered into muttering, but his words still burned. "You're nothing without me." He turned and stomped back inside, leaving her shivering alone in the dark, dripping storm. Melissa didn't move right away. She let the rain pour over her, washing her face, cooling the fire of shame in her chest. She looked down at her hands, clenched so tightly around her cardigan that her knuckles were white. She asked herself the question she had been avoiding for too long. Why was she still here, enduring this? And somewhere deep inside, another question stirred, heavier, louder. What would happen when something finally broke? Melissa was in her early 30s, a nurse who worked long and tiring hours at the hospital. She was known for being gentle with her patients, always ready with a kind smile, even when her own body begged for rest. But behind that calm face, Melissa carried a heavy secret. She was the one keeping her home together. Every bill, every rent payment, every grocery trip came from her pocket. She had been doing it alone for over a year, though no one knew except her. Her life had become a cycle of work and sacrifice. Melissa often left for her shifts before the sun came up, and returned long after it had gone down. Some nights, she would sit at the small dining table, her scrub still on, and go through her notebook filled with numbers. She wrote carefully, stretching each paycheck as far as she could. Dreams she once had, traveling, going back to school, or even just buying herself a new dress, were packed away at the back of her mind. Stability was all that mattered now. And stability meant keeping the lights on, keeping the rent paid, and keeping Anthony's pride untouched. Anthony was her husband. To anyone outside their home, he was the picture of charm. He knew how to laugh at the right time, how to smile wide when neighbors passed, and how to tell stories that made him look successful. People liked him, trusted him. Melissa had once been drawn to that same light, but inside their home, away from the watching world, Anthony was different. His words were sharp. His pride was fragile. He wanted to be the man who provided, but that role had slipped from him a year ago when he lost his job. Since then, Anthony had lived in denial. He pretended he was still in charge, still the provider. He acted as though Melissa's paycheck was only a small help, not the lifeline it truly was. And whenever she came close to speaking the truth, he would shut her down with shame. "What kind of wife embarrasses her husband?" he would say. "Keep your mouth shut." People don't need to know. And Melissa, torn between fear and loyalty, always fell silent. But not everyone was blind. Carla, Melissa's younger sister, often sensed that something was wrong. Whenever Melissa visited her, Carla would watch her carefully, noticing the tired eyes, the way she avoided talking about Anthony. "Are you sure you're okay?" Carla would ask. Melissa would always answer with the same quiet smile and a soft, "I'm fine." But Carla didn't believe it. She knew her sister too well. Then there was Mr. Green, the landlord. He was an older man, quiet and firm, but he had a soft spot for Melissa. He had noticed over the past year that it was always her who brought the rent money, never Anthony. She always paid on time, sometimes even early, and always with a polite thank you. Mr. Green never asked questions, but the respect in his eyes told her he understood more than he said. Melissa often felt caught in the middle of two worlds. In one, she was a loyal wife, protecting her husband's pride, keeping his failures hidden. In the other, she was a woman drowning in exhaustion, begging silently for someone to notice, to help her. But help never came. She carried it all, month after month, until the weight settled deep into her bones. At night, when Anthony slept soundly beside her, Melissa would lie awake staring at the ceiling. Her chest felt heavy as she thought of the money slipping through her hands, of the bills that seemed to grow larger each month. Sometimes, she imagined what it would feel like to live only for herself, to breathe without fear of Anthony's temper, to laugh without worrying who might hear. But the thought always ended with guilt. She had chosen this life. She had promised to stay. Yet the cracks were growing. Anthony's arrogance, his constant need to appear strong, made her feel smaller with each passing day. Carla's worried glances, Mr. Green's quiet respect, her own endless fatigue. They were all signs pointing toward a truth Melissa didn't want to face. She was trapped, yes. Trapped between loyalty to a man who tore her down, and the faint hope of freedom that whispered to her in the quiet moments. She had given up so much for stability, but lately, she wondered if what she was protecting was worth the cost. How much longer could she carry this alone? And how much more would Anthony take before something inside her finally gave way? Anthony's ego cracked one evening when he went out to dinner with a group of friends. They laughed, drank, and ate as if life was simple. And for a while Anthony managed to keep up the act, but when the bill arrived, everything changed. His friend Tom picked it up first and joked, "Come on, Anthony, why don't you cover this one? Big man like you should have no problem." Anthony's smile froze. His pockets were empty, but he couldn't say it. He fumbled, stuttered, and finally, Melissa quietly pulled out her card and paid. She didn't say a word, but Tom's smirk said everything. "Looks like the wife's got this one," he teased. The table erupted in laughter. Anthony laughed too, but his jaw tightened. Inside, shame burned hotter than fire. The moment cut him deeper than any insult. He left the restaurant with his hand gripping Melissa's arm too tightly, his face stiff with forced calm. When they got home, the mask dropped. Anthony slammed the door so hard the walls shook. "You humiliated me," he roared. "In front of everyone. You made me look like less of a man." Melissa's eyes widened. "Anthony, I was only trying to help. I didn't want them to see you struggling." "Help?" He spat the word out like poison. "You think you're the provider now? You think you're better than me?" Melissa tried to explain, but her words were drowned out by his anger. He paced like a caged animal, his pride bleeding from the wound Tom's joke had left. Then in a sudden burst, he grabbed Melissa's wrist and yanked her toward the door. "You need to learn your place," he shouted. Before she could stop him, he dragged her outside into the storm. Rain poured down in heavy sheets, soaking her instantly. She stumbled, her cardigan clinging to her like a second skin, her hair plastered to her face. Anthony stood tall, his voice loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "This is what happens when you forget who's in charge," he yelled. "You're nothing without me, nothing." Melissa said nothing. She stood there, drenched and broken, holding herself tight. Behind curtains, shadows of neighbors peeked, then disappeared, unwilling to get involved. Shame pressed down on her chest, but deeper than that was exhaustion. She could no longer tell if she was holding her silence to protect him, or if she was simply too tired to fight. When Anthony finally stormed back inside, leaving her shivering in the rain, Melissa lingered. The storm beat against her skin, but inside, another storm began to rise. Later that night, when the house was quiet, Melissa collapsed on the edge of their bed. Tears streamed down her face as she buried her head in her hands. The question she had been avoiding for months came back stronger than ever. Why was she still protecting him? Why was she covering his lies while he tore her down? She wiped her face and stood. Something inside her told her to check the drawer where Anthony kept old mail. She pulled it open and froze. Piled up inside were letters, unopened and hidden. With shaking hands, she tore them open one by one. Her heart sank. Bills, unpaid and overdue. Credit card debt, in her name. Threats of eviction. Final notices stamped in red. Anthony hadn't just ignored their problems. He had buried them under lies, leaving her to carry the weight alone. Melissa sat on the floor surrounded by papers, her breath coming fast. The truth was clear now. This wasn't just about pride, or keeping the peace, or staying loyal. This was about survival. If she stayed in this house, in this marriage, in Anthony's shadow, she would lose herself completely. For the first time, she felt a spark of something she had forgotten. Anger, yes, but also clarity. She could not keep pretending. She could not keep protecting a man who was destroying her life piece by piece. The storm outside had passed, but inside Melissa, another one was only beginning. Melissa finally broke her silence one Sunday afternoon when she visited Carla. Her sister poured her a cup of tea, then studied her face carefully. Melissa looked thinner than before, her eyes tired and dull. "Melissa," Carla said softly, "I know something is wrong. You can't keep telling me you're fine." For a moment, Melissa stayed quiet, her hands wrapped around the warm cup. Then the words spilled out. She told Carla about Anthony dragging her into the rain, about the hidden bills, the debt in her name, the threats of eviction. She spoke in a low voice, as if saying it too loudly might make it worse. Carla reached across the table and grabbed her hand. "You need to leave him. Before it's too late. He's breaking you, Melissa. Can't you see that?" Tears filled Melissa's eyes. She shook her head. "It's not that simple. He's my husband. I made vows. And I don't even know where I'd go." Carla squeezed her hand tighter. "You'd come to me. You're not alone. Please, Melissa, don't wait until he ruins you completely." Melissa nodded but said nothing more. The thought of leaving burned inside her, but fear kept her tied down. Back at home, things grew worse. Anthony's anger turned into something colder, sharper. He started demanding her debit card, saying he needed to manage the money properly. When she refused at first, he accused her of hiding things from him. "What kind of wife keeps secrets from her husband?" he shouted until she gave in. Soon he began checking her phone, scrolling through her messages, demanding to know who she was talking to. Melissa felt her world shrinking around her. At night, Anthony sat alone, lost in his pride. He had convinced himself he could still turn things around. He started going out late, meeting people she didn't know. He told himself he was fixing everything, but in truth he was gambling. Each loss only made him more desperate. Each small win fueled the lie that one day he'd pay back all the debts and make Melissa see him as the provider again. But the house grew colder. Where there had once been laughter and light, there was now silence. Melissa came home from her long shifts, exhausted, only to find Anthony waiting with a new argument. He criticized her cooking, her tone of voice, even the way she looked at him. She began moving quietly through her own home, careful not to spark his temper. Then came the moment that broke something inside her. One afternoon, Melissa overheard two neighbors talking while she hung clothes outside. They didn't see her at first. "Anthony told me he pays for everything in that house," one of them whispered. "Can you believe Melissa just sits at home? Poor man, carrying all the weight." The other neighbor sighed. "She always looked lazy to me. I guess now we know." Melissa's hands froze on the wet fabric. Heat rose to her face, shame pressing hard against her chest. She turned quickly, pretending she hadn't heard, but the sting followed her inside. Anthony had been lying about her. Not only was she paying for everything, but he had painted her as a burden to the world. That night, she confronted him. "Why would you tell people you pay for everything? Why would you say I do nothing?" Anthony's face twisted with anger. "Do you want me to tell them the truth? That my wife is so desperate to control me, she pays the bills herself? That I'm living off her pity? Is that what you want?" Melissa's breath caught. His words cut deep, not because they were true, but because of how proudly he twisted them into an attack. She realized then that he would rather destroy her name than admit his weakness. From that day, whispers followed her. At the market, at the clinic, in church, people looked at her differently. Some with pity, others with judgment. She carried it quietly, but inside her dignity eroded piece by piece. Melissa lay awake many nights after that, staring at the ceiling, her heart heavy. She thought of Carla's warning, before it's too late. She thought of the neighbor's gossip, of Mr. Green's quiet eyes when she handed him rent. She thought of Anthony's words echoing in her head. "You're nothing without me." But she knew the truth. She was the one paying, the one working, the one sacrificing. And Anthony, the man she once trusted, was tearing her down while standing on the foundation she built. The weight of that truth grew heavier each day. Melissa began to see her reflection differently in the mirror, not just as a tired nurse or a frightened wife, but as a woman who was slowly disappearing. She wondered how much longer she could endure. And deep inside, a quiet thought began to form. A thought she wasn't ready to admit aloud, but one she could no longer ignore. If I stay, I will lose myself completely. Melissa reached her breaking point one Saturday evening at a family gathering. The living room was full of relatives, laughing, chatting, eating. For a moment, she almost felt normal, surrounded by the warmth of family. But Anthony couldn't resist. He stood in the center of the room, glass in hand, voice louder than anyone else's. "You all know I carry this family on my back," he boasted, his eyes sweeping over the crowd. "Melissa would be nothing without me. She doesn't know how hard it is to be a real man to provide." The room went quiet. Melissa froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. Her chest tightened as his words sank in. She had heard them before in private, whispered or shouted in anger, but never here. Never in front of everyone she loved. Her cheeks burned with shame. Carla shot up from her chair, her eyes blazing. "Enough, Anthony," she snapped. The room gasped. Carla rarely raised her voice, but now it rang like thunder. Anthony smirked. "What's your problem? Can't you let me speak the truth?" Carla turned to the room, her voice shaking but strong. "Truth? You want the truth? Melissa is the one paying every bill. She's the one keeping the roof over your head. Not you. You've been lying to everyone." The air grew heavy. Forks clinked against plates as hands stilled. All eyes turned to Anthony, then to Melissa. She sat frozen, her face pale, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. Anthony's smirk faltered. "That's a lie," he said quickly, his voice rising. "Carla doesn't know what she's talking about. I provide. I always have." But then from the back of the room, a quiet voice spoke. "That's not true." Everyone turned. Mr. Green, their landlord, had been invited as an old family friend. He stood with his hands folded, his face calm but firm. "I've collected rent from Melissa every month. Not once has Anthony paid me. She works hard and never fails. The truth is hers to own, not his." The silence that followed was deafening. The family stared at Anthony, shock written on every face. Murmurs spread quickly. "All this time, he lied to us. Poor Melissa." Anthony's face darkened, anger replacing shame. He slammed his glass down on the table, making it rattle. "You all believe them over me? My own wife, my sister-in-law, and some landlord? You think I'm a liar?" His voice cracked under the weight of exposure. Melissa's hands trembled in her lap. She had always stayed quiet, always kept his pride intact, but something inside her shifted. She rose slowly to her feet. For the first time in years, her voice didn't shake. "They're right, Anthony," she said, her tone steady. "I pay for everything. Every rent check, every grocery trip, every bill. And you've been tearing me down while standing on what I built." Gasps echoed through the room. Anthony's fists clenched. He stepped toward her, his eyes wild, his body tense as if ready to lash out. For a moment, the family held their breath, afraid something violent would happen. But Melissa did not flinch. She stood tall, shoulders squared, meeting his glare with steady eyes. "You will not silence me anymore," she said firmly. Anthony froze, shocked at her defiance. The room seemed to tilt as power shifted in that instant. The man who had always shouted her into silence now stood exposed, his lies unraveling in front of everyone. Melissa took a deep breath and looked around at the faces of her family, then back at Anthony. "I'm done. I won't live like this any longer. I'm leaving." The words hung heavy in the air, final and sharp. Anthony opened his mouth, but no words came out. He could see it in her eyes. This wasn't a threat or a plea. It was a decision. An irreversible moment. The family began murmuring again, some rushing to Melissa's side, others shaking their heads at Anthony. Carla wrapped her arm around her sister, whispering, "You're brave. You're not alone." For the first time in years, Melissa felt her chest lift, as though she had been carrying a mountain and suddenly let it go. The fear that once kept her chained was gone. Anthony's power over her had ended. The storm that had been building inside her had finally broken. And in the wreckage, Melissa found her strength. Melissa quietly packed her belongings the next morning. She moved slowly through the bedroom, folding her clothes, slipping her nursing books into a small bag, and taking only what truly belonged to her. There was no shouting, no noise, just the sound of drawers opening and closing. She wanted peace, not chaos. Anthony woke to the sight of her suitcase by the door. His eyes widened. "Melissa? No. You can't leave." She didn't answer right away. She kept folding a sweater, placing it neatly in her bag. "Please," he begged, his voice breaking. "I'll change. I'll do better. Don't go." When she didn't look at him, his tone shifted. Anger rushed back into his voice. "You think you can just walk away? After everything I've done for you? You're nothing without me." Melissa finally turned to him, her eyes calm. "I was nothing with you. I'm leaving to find myself again." Her words cut deeper than any argument. Anthony's shoulders slumped. He sank onto the bed, burying his face in his hands. For the first time, Melissa saw shame in him. Not pride, not anger, but shame. He realized his life was unraveling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Carla arrived soon after, helping Melissa carry her bags to the car. She held her sister's hand tightly. "You're stronger than you know," she whispered. "You were never powerless. He only made you feel that way." With Carla's support, Melissa felt her chest lift for the first time in years. The chains of silence and fear were gone. Meanwhile, Anthony's world began to collapse. Friends who once admired him now avoided him, whispering behind his back. His lies had been exposed, his pride shattered. The debts he had hidden piled higher each day. The landlord no longer gave him respect or patience. Mr. Green's patience was for Melissa, not him. Soon, eviction notices came, stamped in red. The house that had once been his shield of pride slipped through his fingers. Melissa, on the other hand, found a small apartment not far from the hospital. It was modest, just 2 rooms, a little balcony, and pale curtains that let the light shine through. But it was hers. Every chair, every plate, every pillow was chosen with care. There was no shouting in this space, no cold silences, no fear of what mood would come through the door. She stood by the window one evening, looking out at the city lights. For the first time in a long time, she felt safe. She felt free. The apartment wasn't big, but it was filled with peace, with air she could finally breathe. Most of all, it was filled with self-respect. Melissa had chosen herself, and that choice made her stronger than she had ever been. One rainy evening months later, Melissa stood on the balcony of her small apartment. The rain tapped softly against the railings, a gentle storm rolling through the night. She wrapped her cardigan around her shoulders, the same one she had once clutched while standing broken in the rain outside her old home. She watched the drops fall, the streets shining under the streetlights. And in that moment, memories returned. The night Anthony had dragged her outside, shouting, humiliating her while neighbors watched. Back then, she had felt crushed, powerless, like the rain was washing her away. But now, standing on her balcony, she realized something powerful. That night had not been her ending. It had been her beginning. It was the night she was reborn. The night she began to see that her silence was killing her more than his words. The night that eventually led her here. To freedom, to peace, to a life she could finally call her own. Melissa took a deep breath, the cool air filling her lungs. She smiled through the tears that slipped down her cheeks. They were not tears of pain anymore, but of release, of gratitude for the strength she had found within herself. Sometimes leaving wasn't weakness. Sometimes it was survival. And survival, she now knew, was the bravest choice she could ever make. She looked out at the storm as it began to fade, the clouds breaking apart to reveal the faint glow of the moon. Wiping her face, she whispered to herself, her voice steady and sure. "I choose me. Hi loves. Two hearts, thanks so much for staying till the end." Don't forget to like, share your thoughts in the comments, and hit that subscribe button for more. See you next time. Cherry Blossom Sparkles.